I'm going to be talking about the psychology of babies. I think what we've learned from science, when we take videos of babies, we slow them down, we look at them frame by frame, we do quite sophisticated experiments, that we've become aware that babies have very complicated psychologies. And the more we understand what babies are experiencing, the more we understand how what we do with them affects their experience and their development, then the more we're better placed to organise ourselves and our society so that we can give babies the best start in life. If there's one thing we can say about babies, human babies compared to babies of other species, is that we are entirely dependent on our carers to bring us up and for us to survive. And so it's very important for babies to get into relationships with somebody who's going to look after them well. So biology has meant that babies and the adults are geared up to be in relationship with each other from the start. And we can see this from experimental studies that look at how adults respond to babies. Now, babies have a number of special features about them. They have wide set eyes and wide foreheads with the eyes placed in the middle of the forehead, and chubby cheeks. And even animals also have baby features, and these draw us to them and make us feel that they are attractive and that we want to be in contact with them. And if we look at people's responses to babies, our brains are geared up to respond to them, so that when we see a picture of a baby's face compared to an adult's face, particular parts of the brain are activated, the same parts that are activated in relation to our romantic attachments. They're parts of the brain associated with feelings of pleasure and reward. And these feelings to babies in general are even stronger in relation to our own babies. Hormones are involved in this as well, particularly the hormone oxytocin, which again is associated with feelings of trust and empathy. So the whole biology of parents is there in place from the start to put us into good, affectionate relationship with babies. And not only our biology, but our behaviour too, so that when we make contact with a baby, when we get into eye contact, a whole series of behaviours are released almost automatically, which we can call intuitive parenting, so that the adult will flash their eyebrow, they will nod their head, they will smile and probably vocalise as a way of pulling the baby into contact with them. Everything about us changes, including our voice quality, the pitch rises, the intonation changes, it becomes melodic, repetitive, short utterances. In fact, just the kinds of stimuli that babies themselves like. We see a little bit more about what babies like from experiments that have been done over the decades now. It's been shown that if you just show very simple stimuli, one looking a little bit like a baby's a face, or the same kind of patterns but jumbled up compared to a blank face, then babies will prefer to look at or turn towards the paddleboard that looks a bit like a face. So they're geared from the newborn period to be attracted to people's faces. And not just faces, but faces that are ready to be in engagement with them. So they will prefer to look at faces where the eyes are open compared to eyes closed. And an even more subtle distinction, they prefer to look at faces where those open eyes are facing forward, available to be in contact, compared to faces where the gaze is averted to one side. And again, we'll look more, we'll turn more towards that face that's ready to be in contact with them. Not only do newborn babies prefer just human stimuli in general, but they also develop a rapid preference for the people who are looking after them. So they very quickly get to know their mother's face, her voice, even her smell, and send out cues to that person that they like to be in contact with them. And this again helps to forge the sense of being in relationship. One of the most remarkable findings of all the research that has been done on babies is that even newborns can imitate the facial expression of an adult who sits in front of them and poses it clearly, like a mouth opening or a tongue protrusion. Now, this may seem trivial and unimportant, but if we just think for a moment about what that involves. The baby's never seen themselves in a mirror, they don't know what their own face looks like, and yet they're somehow matching the visual image of somebody else's mouth opening or tongue protrusion with the felt perception of their own mouth movement. And that indicates that there is already a fundamental system in place for babies to feel as though they are in some sense like the other person, that they are in contact with them, connected to them. And this has been seen as important in laying the foundations for feelings of empathy and being in relationship with somebody else. Its evolutionary roots seem to be there in place as well, because one of our colleagues, in fact a visiting professor to our department in Reading, Pierre Ferrari, has done groundbreaking work with rhesus macaque newborns and shown the same phenomena there, that they will do mouth opening and tongue protrusion within just a short time following birth. So our biological preparedness lays these foundations and gets babies and their carers into relationship with each other very quickly, and yet it's a fact that the relationships that babies have with their carers vary markedly. And this is important since humans have to adjust to a very wide variety of environments, whether we bring babies up in the Arctic tundra, whether we're cared for by siblings in the Bangladesh desert, whether our fathers are very involved, whether we grow up in downtown Manhattan and spend our time in Central Park, or whether we're a member of the British elite establishment. Our experiences of parenting are all going to be very different, and the demands of our environment are very different. So there has to be flexibility as well as these biological preparedness. And so there are big cultural differences between societies that place different demands on parents in the way they bring up children. Within a given culture, there are also huge varieties in background in terms of how much poverty there is, people's educational opportunities, and even within a set group in a society, there are big individual differences in terms of our mental health, even our values and our individual strengths and difficulties, and these will all affect our parenting. And by studying parenting in these different kinds of circumstances and putting it together with the way children develop, we can learn more about how it is that different kinds of parenting affect a child's development. And once we have that understanding, then we're better placed to intervene if things are going wrong, or if we want to produce different outcomes for our children. And I'm going to be looking at some of these differences in relation to the work that I've been doing here with my colleagues, and think about cross-cultural differences, the effects of parental ill health, in particular think about parental depression, and think about parenting in conditions of socio-economic adversity. And the main theme of what I'm going to be saying about parenting is that of the specificity of effects. That is, that particular parenting practices are each associated with particular patterns of child development. And for an individual parent, just because we may have strengths in one area of our parenting doesn't automatically mean that we're going to be strong in all other areas. Now, in doing so, I'm going to think about child development in distinct different domains. First of all, social understanding, then emotion regulation and self-control, our attachment security, and finally our cognitive development, because each of these areas of development is distinct, and each one of them requires a different kind of input in order for children to grow up well and flourish. So this first domain, that of social understanding. There are huge advances in an infant's life over the first 2 years in their social understanding, starting from the newborn with that very basic attraction for human stimuli, through to the 2-year-old who has something which we can call theory of mind. And that refers to the ability to understand that someone else might have a different experience from your own. It also includes feelings like and experiences like being self-aware, being empathic, and being able to cooperate with other people. And we know that it's important where a child gets to by the age of 2 in terms of their social understanding, because it predicts the quality of their later social relationships as well as their own later social understanding. So I'm going to take you through some of the particular parenting practices that are very good at supporting good social understanding. In the first 3 months or so, infants are remarkably social. They have a wide range of facial gestures and expressions. They vocalize, they smile, they make reliable eye-to-eye contact. And it's very common for parents interacting with their babies at that stage to automatically, without even thinking about it, mirror back what the baby has done, elaborate on it, repeat, and mark it out as something significant. And we know that that kind of responsiveness is quite good at laying the foundations for understanding other people and for later empathy. But babies don't remain content to just engage in face-to-face contact. And by the time they're 6 months old, they got rather bored with those early kinds of contacts and they want something more complex. And at that stage, parents adapt to that in the way they play with the baby. And typically, play and interactions become triadic, and they can involve both parents, where one will set up an expectation of something going to happen that the other parent will then do. So the baby's awareness of social interactions is expanded. Then, as babies get towards 9 months, they are very interested in how other people experience the world. And again, without even thinking about it, parents who are good at picking up on the baby's interest will signal in a special way with their facial expression. Again, we see this raised brow, the slightly open mouth, probably a nodding head and a vocalization, as this mother holds up the fruit she's preparing for the baby. And studies have shown that have looked at babies' brain responses that when adults signal something in the environment to them and share it, the baby's processing of the environment is more efficient. So these, again, these very simple automatic behaviors are actually doing something quite complicated and helpful. Again, support for social understanding changes as the baby develops. So we see at 12 months, parents will typically play games with their babies involving pretend. Is Teddy thirsty? Do you think he would like a drink? And that kind of play can give the child the opportunity to move outside their own mind and think about what might be in the Teddy's mind. It's a kind of mind experiment play. It also shows up in teasing games that parents can support with their children. Everybody knows exactly what's happening, but it's played over and over again. So here, this little baby, he's about 10 months old, he's offered his father a little tomato, and the father's shown willingness to accept it. And just at the point that the father's going to take it into his mouth, the baby whips it back and pops it in his own mouth. And the father puts on this expression of mock shock and horror, which sends the little baby into rails of laughter. And so what the baby's doing here is actually doing mind experiments. He's playing with his father's mental state, manipulating it in a very shared, harmonious way, but it's exercising the baby's capacity to think about other people's experience. And then they become very fond of engaging in joint projects, just something simple like picking berries together. Again, thinking about someone else's point of view and what they're doing and wanting to achieve. Even squabbling's helpful for theory of mind skills. Studies have shown that siblings who squabble quite a lot are actually rather better on theory of mind tasks than those who perhaps are only children or who have a completely harmonious family, because as you see in this pair of children, the baby has a brother who's actually trying to be helpful and show him how you can make a paper aeroplane with his book, and the baby's absolutely outraged. But when he sees what his brother's done, folding the paper in an interesting way, he's actually had the experience through that little bit of conflict of seeing that there are other ways of thinking about the world. And finally, talking about mental states is particularly good at promoting children's understanding of other people, understanding their feelings. And a particularly good way of doing that is through picture books, and I'll be coming on to more about book sharing later on. So one way in which we can see the impact of these kinds of styles of parenting is by looking at different cultures that have very different value systems in terms of social development for their children. We can look on the one hand at what we might term very individualistic cultures like our own or North American or other European countries, where parents like to focus on the individual child and give a lot of intense individual feedback for their every expression and movement. There are other cultures that don't have that same value systems, which are often referred to as affiliative societies, where what is valued more is the coming together as a group and sharing. And some researchers, that this is not our own research, this is by Heidi Keller working in Germany, have compared the quality of early interactions in different cultures and seen what the impact is on children's social development. They've looked at a group called the Nassau, which is a rural society living in the Cameroon, with a German sample, and looked at the quality of early interactions week by week in totally naturalistic situations, just going in and filming whatever was happening without any instruction at all. Actually, what they find is that the two cultures are both very responsive to the babies. So they're both contingently responding to what the child's done most of the time, and there's really very little difference in the amount of responsiveness between them. What does differ, though, is the kind of response. So for those in the Nassau group, they start off similar to the German mothers, but then diverge as the weeks go on and use touch and physical contact more and more with their babies, often carrying them perhaps on their backs or perhaps spending more time breastfeeding them. Whereas those in Germany are doing very different things. They're doing much more of that intense face-to-face contact. So we can take these two societies and then look at what happens to the children's social awareness later on and see that there are quite big differences. This is a task which is one of the infant's self-awareness, which you expect to get in a very individuated society, in which you put a red dot without the baby knowing on the tip of their nose and then let them play around until they've no memory of having the dot put on, and then let them see a mirror. And babies in our culture will typically have some awareness that the baby they see in the mirror is themselves, because they will touch their nose when they see the dot on the mirror baby's nose. Here's this baby showing this odd thing to her mother. And this doesn't happen to the same extent in societies that favour this more affiliative communal style. So that's the first domain, the social understanding. Now I'm going to turn to the second one of emotion regulation, and this has to do with how babies come to manage difficult feelings and states. And I'm going to focus in particular on the management of aggressive impulses, although it also includes experiences like overcoming inhibition, internalizing rules. Early aggression is important. It's completely normal behavior. From ages 1 to 2, we have this phrase, the terrible twos, and in fact it's usually the most aggressive period in our lifespan. Most children grow out of being aggressive by the time they're 3 years old. But if aggression has settled into a persistent and pervasive pattern by the time a child is 3 to 4, then it's a particularly strong predictor of that child developing into an aggressive or perhaps even violent adolescent or adult. So it's important to know what can be done to handle aggression and to help children manage it. This again goes through distinct phases, but they involve very different sorts of parenting techniques from those supporting social understanding. The newborn baby can have no clue as to why he feels desperate or frightened or cold, and may lose control of his state very easily, in which case holding him and patting and soothing are effective and have all been shown to have important physiological influences on the child's state. But that changes, and by 2 months even, things are going on between adults and babies that are already beginning to exercise the baby's capacity to manage slightly different experiences. So here, for example, a mother who's been engaging very responsively with her baby and playing a game which she calls kissy kissy, where she goes, mwah. And at some point she just does the movement in a way that's a little bit strong for the baby, a little bit beyond his capacity to take it. And we can see the baby's look of shock and surprise when she comes in, looms quickly. Now the mother notices this change in his expression quite quickly and notes it and sympathizes with the baby, and then she does something really interesting. She moves to sympathize with him and to repeat the same movement, but at a much gentler level, so that the baby has the experience of the same thing happening, but in a way that he can manage and exercise his capacities to cope with it. Then as babies grow up more, when they get to around 4 months and they get bored of these face-to-face interactions, they become really keen on these excited body games where parents will loom in and tickle them and nuzzle in and make funny noises. And again, this is a good opportunity for supporting babies' capacities to self-regulate. So we can see here on the top right that the baby is just turning away her gaze. Now, this again might seem trivial and unimportant, but actually regulating their experience by changing direction of gaze is one of the baby's really effective capacities to regulate their state and bring themselves into a calm state so that they're not getting out of control. And then games become more and more complex and more boisterous through the rest of the next period, through to 2 years, with rough and tumble games, risky games in which you can pretend to be a scary monster and crawl after your baby, or even doing play fighting. Well, these are all carried out within the context of an affectionate relationship where the parent's monitoring the baby's level of excitement and capacity to tolerate that intensity. Then it's seen to be a very good predictor of the child's capacity to manage their difficult emotions as they get older. Other things are useful too, daily routine practices in the home which we might not give a second thought to, but are actually helping the development of babies' emotion regulation. Having a routine. If you're a baby and you're absolutely really hungry and you don't have a routine, you don't know when your food's going to come, it's going to be difficult for you to control that hunger and wait. But if your mother sets you up so that she always does the same thing, she puts you in the high chair, she puts your bib on, she stirs the food in a certain way before she gives it to you, you'll be able to hang on to that difficult feeling and know that the food will come. And babies who have this experience of predictability and routine in their lives are likely to have better regulation. Of particular importance to the development of aggression is how we handle difficult moments, oppositional behaviour, where the most important thing is to be non-coercive, not harsh or punitive, but still be consistent and retain warmth. Here's a baby who takes one look at the toothbrush and decides she absolutely does not want to have her teeth brushed today. And what should the mother do? Should she get the baby harshly and force the brush in? That would just escalate the baby's aggression and difficulty. Should she just give up and say, okay, we won't do toothbrushing today? That would reinforce the child's sense that all they have to do to get out of a difficult feeling is to make a fuss, and the adult will give up. So instead what the mother does is to make a game of this quite difficult situation and mime toothbrushing while the baby's been feeling quite cross with her and is prepared just to look at her through this little net. But it becomes quite interesting for her to see, within a short period, the mother's able to get what she wants to do done without there having been an intense conflict. Well, we can see these sorts of processes and the impact of parenting by looking at special populations. And as David mentioned, I've done quite a lot of my research on mothers who experience postnatal depression. Depression's very common. It happens to about 10 to 15% of us after childbirth. In high-income countries, in low-income countries, it's even more common, affecting up to 35% of people. It's an incapacitating disorder and it affects social relationships, and we need to be able to help mothers who are depressed. So it's useful for us to study what happens between them and their babies and what the effects are. This is something I've been doing in a longitudinal sample of infants I studied from birth until quite recently at age 22 years, and this is some of the data from that longitudinal study. So we found, as many other people have, that when a mother's feeling depressed, it's quite often the case that she will feel quite irritable and cross with her baby. And we can see this even in subtle ways in face-to-face interactions, even at 2 months postpartum. And we follow those same children up to 5 years and find that the children of those mothers who are postnatally depressed are more likely to be rated by teachers as well as by their mothers as having clinically problematic levels of aggression. And the important thing is that early hostility from the mother that predicts the development of child aggression behaviour. You can see vicious cycles getting set up over the first few months, which then get perpetuated. So that's the second domain. So I turn now to the third one, which is all about attachment. I think a lot of people probably know about attachment or have heard of attachment. It's such an important aspect of our development. And when we think of attachments, we like to divide them up as researchers into those where the child becomes secure or else insecure. When a child is secure, it's not that they're totally independent, it's just that they're aware of their dependency on other people and they're not worried about it. They trust that their care is available and will be responsive to them when needed. And they're not overly dependent and clingy. They will show a balance between going to their parent when they need support, but then also being free and confident to explore the environment. And attachment's important because it's one of the strongest predictors of our general adjustment and the quality of our intimate relationships, as well as mental health. I'm just going to show you a couple of classic attachment scenarios because they're quite different from, say, play interactions where there are no big emotions at stake or cognitive support or social understanding. Attachment responsiveness is needed at a time when an infant is distressed, and it can show up in something like separation anxiety. Here we have a baby at home with her mother. A friend's come round with her baby to have tea, and her mother's leaving the room. The baby's now about 7 months, and she's becoming aware of her dependency on her mum. So when her mother's left, she begins to be upset, and the friend takes hold of her, but she doesn't settle down. It's only when her mother comes back and comforts her that she can become happy again and then become interested in what her little friend is doing. So the mother has acknowledged that difficulty in the baby and responded to it in a way to soothe her, and that makes for a secure attachment. We also see attachment needs in a situation where a baby is frightened or feeling vulnerable, as might happen if an unfamiliar person comes into the house, as happened here with this baby. This is a man, a male visitor, come to the home. The baby hasn't met before. The man tries to make friends with the baby, and this baby is now around 8 months old. He's at that stage of what we call stranger fear, where he knows that this isn't the person that he normally has to look after him and whom he trusts, and snuggles into his mum. Now, if a parent responds by saying, "Oh, don't be so silly," and rejects that so-called babyish behaviour, then the child may find it more difficult to form a secure attachment to their carer. But with this kind of care, the baby's going to feel secure and will develop a sense of self-worth and confidence. Now, giving the kind of support that is good for promoting a child's secure attachment is again quite difficult for mothers who suffer from depression. This is partly because depressed mothers have often had attachment difficulties in their own childhoods and perhaps don't have good support and good care from their own mothers. So it's been found in many studies that the children of mothers who are postnatally depressed are more likely to be insecurely attached to their mothers than children of well mothers. It's important to say in all these findings for depression that they're not inevitable. What depression does is just raise the risk, and it's important to note too that many depressed mothers give very good care to their children and don't run into these problems, but the risks are nevertheless raised. In our longitudinal study, we were able to look at the children's development through to adolescence when we might begin to see the onset of depression in the children themselves, and found indeed it was the case that by 16 years, 40% of the children in our depressed group sample had become depressed themselves, whereas the children whose mothers had not been postnatally depressed were at a much lower risk for becoming depressed. And that risk for depression was carried in large measure by the fact that early on in development, the children of the postnatally depressed mothers had been insecurely attached to them. So now the last domain of development, the cognitive domain, before I turn to some work on interventions we've done. So cognitive refers to a whole range of things like paying attention, learning, language, reasoning. And it's important to get established well by 2 years because it's highly stable from infancy. And you can measure an infant's IQ at 18 months or 2 years, and it will show a high predictability to adolescent IQ and even to academic achievements. And again, this requires specific patterns of support and parenting for babies' cognitive development to flourish. This is an area where babies push their own development along particularly strongly, just giving a child an opportunity to mess around with food, to practice which angle you need to place your spoon to get that pea onto it. They will endlessly chuck things down from their high chair, and if they're lucky, have a patient parent who will pick things up for them. It's a pain in the neck, but it actually is the baby learning a lot about physical objects and gravity. Or they may spend ages, as this little baby did, spent 20 minutes just putting small objects into a tin, putting the lid on, gazing at the covered box. And you can almost see him thinking, is that object that's gone out of sight still there? An important development called the object concept. So babies are doing a lot for themselves, but parenting is also of vital importance. One thing parents need to do to help babies' cognitions is to be generally responsive. We can see this in experiments where we stop a parent being responsive. This is called the still face experiment, where we invite a mother and baby to interact with each other as normal. The baby's active, engaged, and then ask the mother just to stop responding and look at the baby but remain blank. And we see these rapid changes in the baby's behaviour. Even when just a few weeks old, the baby looks puzzled and surprised, makes a bid to get back into contact, And if the mother doesn't respond, after a minute or so, the baby will give up and withdraw. So imagine you have a child who's in an environment where people are not responding to them. They may give up and withdraw into themselves and therefore not experience the richness of the environment in the same way. We can also see the importance of parenting and what we call contingent responsiveness in an experiment. Contingency refers to the parents responding quite quickly to what the infant does in an appropriate way. And we can test this by having a mother and a baby communicate with each other, not in the flesh, but via a closed-circuit television system, so that each partner sees the other one on a screen in front of them, and they can either interact with each other in real live time, or you can relay the image of one partner to the other by a delayed time. So the behaviour seen will be identical, but its relationship in time will be different in the replay condition. It won't be contingent. And we can see how babies react to these different conditions. This is a baby of about 8 weeks old watching her mother in front of her on the screen when the mother behaves contingently. She remains engaged and interested and active. Her mood's positive. She makes social bids with her mouth movements, and all goes well. We give the baby a break for a few minutes, rewind the tape, and show exactly the same film of the mother again, but this time what the mother does is not responsive to what the baby is doing in the moment. And even this infant of a few weeks old, we can see her behaviour changing. She quickly looks rather puzzled and grimaces with her mouth. She turns away, she turns back to check with a frown, and then gives up on the interaction. When she's not sensing that connection, she cuts off from what's going on. And we can just see this, measure this in the baby's gaze, going down in a replay condition, back up if we play it live again, and the same with the baby's smiling. So what else do babies need to support their cognitive development? Well, parents do a lot to help the baby sustain their attention. They might show the baby a toy, and as the baby's attention begins to flag, just do something very simple like twisting it round, and that slight change will keep the baby's interest and attention. And that's important because we know that babies' capacities to keep focused attention is a very good predictor of their later IQ. What we call scaffolding is helpful too. Here, the parent will just support the baby to be able to do something by setting up the situation to enable the baby to achieve something on their own, perhaps by tilting the box round so it's ready to receive the cube, just holding the cube steady for the baby so that she can pop it into the right hole. This is called scaffolding, and it's a major component of cognitive support. But the other thing I want to tell you about is book sharing. Books are particularly good for promoting babies' language and sustaining their attention. Sharing a book with a baby has even been called a language acquisition device. 75% of parents labeling and naming things to the baby happens in the context of sharing picture books with them. And it's a really good predictor of the child's literacy and language, even when we take background features of the parent's family into account, like their social class or their education. But it's not just the amount of book sharing, it's the quality. And what's important is what's called dialogic, to make it a reciprocal two-way thing. So just let the baby explore the book in their own way, to facilitate them in their exploration if they need help, to make links between what's on the page. Here's a mother brushing the baby's hair. She mimes it for the baby. He picks it up and mimes out brushing his own hair. He's really enriching his experience of the book and making the links to his own world. Again, this is an area that sometimes postnatally depressed mothers can have difficulty with. And interestingly, and for complex reasons I won't go into, this seems to be a particular problem for them when they have a baby who's a boy, where we see the level of responsiveness in interactions is lower for depressed mothers of boys
than for either well mothers with girls and boys or depressed mothers with their girls. When we look later at the infant's development, and I'm focusing here on the boys, we find that if we do a mental development test of the baby when they're 18 months old, we see those boys of depressed mothers are having a much lower score, this is equivalent to an IQ, than the boys of control group mothers who are not depressed. And we can do quite sophisticated analyses and see that the degree to which mothers were able to be contingently focused in their interaction with the baby at just 2 months old predicts the child's cognitive score when they're 18 months old. So that's the reason why the depressed mother's boys do poorly, is mediated, it is accounted for by these difficult interactions. Even more strikingly, when we see these boys again at 16 years, these same boys whose mothers were postnatally depressed are scoring lower on each of 7, 1 point grade lower on each of 7 GCSEs compared to boys of mothers who are not postnatally depressed. And these GCSE scores are predicted by the child's IQ in infancy, which remained highly stable from that point onwards. So these are very important effects that have implications for the children's life course trajectories. It's not just depression. We know that poverty too has a major impact on the way that parents interact with their babies, and that in turn affects their children's development. This data is by Hart and Risley. They referred to the early catastrophe and the 30 million word gap by age 3. This is the difference in the number of words that a child whose parents are on welfare will have heard spoken in their immediate environment compared to the number of words heard by children in professional families. And that 30 million word gap predicts the differences in those children's scores on intelligence and language tests through their development. You may all be thinking, well, we just expose children to more words then. Let them watch television, let them have screen time. And of course, this has been very topical. But in fact, the research shows that under 2-year-olds are not actually able to use screen time that is not responsive to them and gain in terms of their language development. What we don't know so much about are interactive games, although the early ones were rather poor. And in fact, there were a lot of commercial products produced for parents, encouraging them to buy them and use them because these would boost the children's IQ. And in the end, the false claims were such that Disney, for one, was forced to repay millions of pounds and to dollars rather to parents for having bought the baby Einstein product. Just on Monday, the newspapers reported an article that came out in the Journal of Pediatrics about interactive screen time, and really the jury's out on that, but I think the authors of the paper are concerned that it should be done well in an evidence-based way, or it could have implications. Now, just to wind up, I want to talk about where we go knowing all this. Can we do things to intervene? And this touches on the research that I've done with Peter Cooper and our colleagues in South Africa in a very impoverished environment where we wanted to do things to improve children's attachment and their cognitive development. In this environment, unsurprisingly, parents face huge stresses and there are high levels of depression. There are a lot of mother-infant interaction difficulties and high levels of infant insecure attachment. Together with Peter and our colleagues, we conducted a randomized controlled trial to see if we could do something to improve the outcome for these children. Pregnant women from KHAYELITSHA were invited to come into the study. You can see how very keen they were to get support. Hardly any of them refused to take part. They were randomized either to getting our intervention or to getting a no treatment control condition. The intervention involved home visiting in pregnancy and through the first 6 months, in which mothers received counselling and help with understanding their baby's cues and in managing their infant's distress. There are no community midwives or health visitors or psychologists, so we use very impressive, locally trained mothers as the people to deliver the treatment. We were pleased to find that at the end of treatment, when the infants were 6 months old, and even a 12-month follow-up, the mothers who'd received that home visiting were significantly more sensitive to their babies than those who'd not received it. Even more exciting for us was the fact that the infants of mothers who'd received it were more likely to be securely attached to their mothers than those who'd not had the intervention. So that was good news. But we were disappointed to find that we had not done a lot to shift the child's cognitive development. When we did the Bailey Mental Development Index, the scores for both the intervention and the control group were quite poor, with IQs around 85 and 83, hardly an important difference. And indeed, there was no difference at all in the Bailey scores for children who'd been rated secure and those who'd been rated insecure. Up until that point, we were not quite so aware of the importance of specificity of effects of parenting, but once we became more aware of it, we realized that our focus had been on attachment issues, and we hadn't given cognitive stimulation and scaffolding support to help mothers promote their infants' cognitive development. This is a major crisis in South Africa, where the Boston School of Education 2007 review of 40 countries, including many lower-income countries, showed South Africa to be at the bottom of the performance table. The South African Department of Basic Education found that most children were not achieving the acceptable performance level, age 9. So there's widespread recognition in South Africa of the need to meet children's cognitive needs. Knowing what we did by then about the advantages of book sharing, we then, this is with Peter Cooper and our colleagues in South Africa, mounted another randomized control trial, this time delivering book sharing support to parents with children of an age when they're beginning to acquire language. So parents were allocated either to an 8-week program receiving book sharing or a no intervention control group, who eventually did receive the program at the end of the study, so they weren't deprived of it. The training was done in small groups with local women again being our trainers and giving PowerPoint presentations, doing role play, lots of exercises. These would meet once a week over 8 weeks, and we would have PowerPoint presentations that just gave very simple messages about how to enjoy sharing a book with your baby, giving help simply perhaps with turning the page. As well as the group part of the sessions, each mother would receive some one-to-one support with a helper where she would look at the book with her baby and get some tips perhaps on how it might be done more effectively. And then she would take away what we called the book of the week and be asked to practice book sharing with her baby for perhaps 10 minutes a day over the following week. What we found at the end of this 8-week program, when we measured the baby's capacity to sustain their attention in a computerized task, was a phenomenal result. This is, in technical terms, more than an effect size that would be equivalent, say, to moving somebody's IQ from an average of 100 up to 116. So it's a massive effect. And as I mentioned before, the capacity to sustain attention is one of the very best predictors of future cognitive development. You see, the control group had not shifted at all during that period in comparison to the group who'd had the intervention. We saw something very similar in terms of the baby's language development there, the number of words that they could say. The control group here had improved a bit, which you expect over 2 months, but the group whose mothers received the book sharing support made a much, much bigger recovery. So these results are truly very encouraging, and they endorse what the Nobel Prize winner James Heckman said in the Heckman equation that it's really worthwhile investing in the early years, that he calculated that for every dollar invested at that period in a child's development is going to yield so much more in terms of the returns on social capital and personal capital than the same amount of money invested later on. And that's why we're now seeing gladly things like the 1001 critical days. Governments are beginning to really understand the importance of early interventions. And I hope what our work has done in particular is to show that by unpacking the different parenting practices and really getting to grips with why it is that what parents do can be useful to different domains of infant development, we can contribute to these early interventions and really make a difference to children's long-term development. So thank you for your attention, and I want to thank in particular my research colleagues, particularly Peter Cooper and Kathy Creswell, Leonardo and Laura, who are here, my colleagues in South Africa, and also for the help with producing this book, The Psychology of Babies, which has been illustrated through my talk, and particularly grateful to Kathy Creswell, Louise Dalton, Colin Guilford, Kyla Vaillancourt, also the people at Merle and Munchwell Park Nursery. So thank you very much.